Wee-hee-hee! So a few months ago, our plastic garden storage box broke, so I thought, why not build myself a box? So keep on watching if you want to see how I made this. So almost 3 months ago, I was kindly sent this Evolution miter saw, and I'd had my heart on creating a shed with it, but instead I thought I'd start small with a miniature shed storage box. And something that completely beat using it on a kitchen table was their stand as well. Although I still had to do cuts indoors because it was raining outside. So here's my materials. I'm going to use feather edge panels and some tanalised timber. And because I was designing the box with a sloping roof, I wanted to cut some feather edge panels first so I could work out the height. I'm pretty sure I did this the long way round, but what I did was just lay out some feather edge panels, temporarily hammered them to some framework, and used a spacing jig that I copied off Colin Furze. This was just some skirting board with a lip, and I'd work out where I wanted the height to start on one side and finish on the opposite. That way I wouldn't be left with a daft little piece that I couldn't hammer in. So I use these pencil marks to work out my slope. But what I would do in future is just create a square panel and sacrifice some top piece to create a slope all in one go. So now I'm working on screwing the frame together. And something I do regret is having the widest framework facing me. And I had to use much longer screws, and it was touch and go whether I had enough. And you can see I'm using a straight edge piece of wood along the side so I can push each panel against it to create a straight edge. So back with the spacer again, lining it up and hammering in the next one. But something I would recommend is to add another batten in the middle to prevent any movement on your feather edge later. So you can't see one now, but I did add one towards the end. And once I'd got to the top, it was time to add another piece of framework, and I just rested it underneath and drew where I needed to cut it. So once I'd done my first panel, I worked on my second one and mirrored it, having the cladding on the opposite side. I also added some tanalised trim. But what did confuse me was I thought I had to use rectangular pieces of framework for this to work, which I now know that is not the case. And because they're just decorative, I'm just hammering them in. So now I'm working on the front and the back. And because I've got a slope, I need to cut the rest of the pieces with a slight miter. And to start my box frame, I clamped two pieces together, but I think I'll definitely be buying some corner clamps to speed this job up next time. And I'd also make sure things were square as I went on. I had a batten between every 30 centimetres. This would offer more strength, and I could hammer the feather edge into it as well. So I'm now clamping this to one of the side panels and pre-drilling holes before screwing it together, and then worked on the opposite side. And I thought now's a good time to just double check measurements and see if it's square.
I'm very pleased. Finally. I've already checked. It's down to the mill all the way down.
Now here's something that I just jumped in too soon, and that was starting the feather edge, because the bottom still needed a stud for a flooring. So again, I'll fix that later. The other thing that I did wrong was the front and back panels that you see now, I decided to rotate the framework. So the narrowest part would face me, but that also meant when I put flooring in later, I need to raise it a little bit. So if you've got rectangular pieces of framework, don't change it as you go. Then for the top piece, because it was overlapping, I'd clamp it in place, draw a line where it needs to be cut, and just trim down with my jigsaw. Now this is the time I noticed, yep, I need a batten at the bottom. So I cut down a piece, popped it in situ and screwed it into place. But it also annoyingly meant that I had to have a screw showing on the already cladded piece that I'd done. So it was time to add a lid. And for this I decided to recycle some of the ply lining from our Mercedes Vito camper van. And it will need some framework, so I'm holding it against it, marking where I need to cut it. And I'm just checking the depth of it so I know what trim to add later. And doing the same old pre-drilling holes and screwing together. So I didn't have a whole sheet of ply lining, and I made do with what I had by just butting them all together. At the moment I'm just screwing it down to the frame, and then I tried cutting the excess off with my jigsaw, but it was much more accurate with a handsaw. And to give it more strength, I added another batten in the middle and screwed along the top. I want to make sure I use a countersunk piece pretty much most of this project, so no screw heads were protruding when something would go on top of it. Also, I don't have a table saw to create the perfect straight edges, and I didn't want to create a weakness when I came to use some felt, so I just used some gaffer tape over some of the seams. Now, because I was going to use a trim after putting on some felt, I created a little template with some hinges on, as if the trim was in place, to see if the lid would open okay. And I found without the trim it opened fully, but with some trim at the back it opened 3/4 of the way, which was enough for us. And I'd mark on the lid where I needed to fix the hinges too. So then I unscrewed them, knowing I could line up with the screw holes later, and then fix to the lid, and then back to the box. Now to make it waterproof on the top, I bought this green felt, but I've got loads left for future sheds. So I'm measuring what I need, and most YouTube videos recommended adding an extra 5 centimeters all the way around. But I added a little bit more because it just meant I only needed to make one cut. Another thing that I was going to use was felt adhesive, but after my dad seeing what I was doing online, he said I didn't actually need it for such a small box, but you do for large sheds. And I'd just tease each corner with my hands and use some 13mm clout nails. The only problem I found later was when I added trim, I had to make sure the nails weren't in my way. Now for the corners, I tried folding them, but I didn't like how much it protruded. So I made a slit with a Stanley knife and folded it over, but make sure the flap is tucked underneath.
Do you want one? Do you want a kennel? Do you want a kennel? Watch your paws so you don't step on those.
So after going all the way around, I then used a Stanley knife again and removed any excess from the bottom of the lid. As for the trim, after cutting it down to size, I initially hammered them on, but I just wasn't happy with how weak they were. So instead I pre-drilled holes and screwed them with screws and washers for detail. This idea actually came from the Strawbite Workshop YouTube channel, and I love how smart it looks. As for the front trim, I decided to add a kitchen door handle to it and screwed it on like the rest. So the next morning I cut down some flooring for it, and this is when I realised it was bowing because I rotated my framework earlier. So I made up for it by fixing some battens exactly the same depth. I also found that I needed to add a batten either side on the inside because I thought there was just too much movement on the feather edge. And finally, because I didn't like the tanalised trim not being the same colour, I just added some stain to it to blend in. And then added a preserve on any of the bits that I was concerned might warp over time. And also a shout out to the Facebook group Woodworking UK. I'll leave a link to it below, but if you ever get stuck and you need a question answering fast, they're a great community and they've helped me so many times in the past when I've needed answers there and then. And what my dad suggested is to rest it on a couple of planks of tanalised timber, but unfortunately I use every piece for this project. But I'll definitely be buying some over the weekend so my hard work doesn't go to waste. Whoop, whoop, whoop.